A crisp March welcome to the Human Needs and Global Resources Spring Symposium, featuring a panel of our alumni tonight, generously sponsored by the John Deere Foundation. It is so good to have you all here. And tonight we give an extra special welcome to our alumni who are here for this event. Alumni? Yeah, good, thank you. Those who are on stage and screen, and others who have come to reconnect and revisit and remember. And we're very eager to hear an update on your lives. So please do stop by and give that to us. I'm Laura Meitzner-Yoder, and I direct the Human Needs and Global Resources program. And for our visitors, this is a program through which students and others learn from local professionals and neighbors and congregations about global church response to the critical human needs in their midst. Hunger students live and work and worship with local communities as they intern for 6 months with host organizations in Asia, Africa, Latin America, and the Middle East. So I want to thank and acknowledge all the Hunger faculty, staff, and students whose dedication has brought this symposium to fruition, especially Jamie Huff and Laura Atkinson and Nina Masalava and Kelly Wilson, and the cohort of the 2023 Hunger interns up here. Welcome back. Who earnestly invite you to stay for their poster session reception after this presentation, and especially they want you to ask them very hard questions. Special request, of course, in the hallway just outside here. So please do stay and have conversations there. To open, let's hear these words from Deuteronomy 10, 17 to 19. For the Lord your God is God of gods and Lord of lords, the great God, mighty and awesome, who shows no partiality and accepts no bribes. God defends the cause of the fatherless and the widow, and loves the foreigner residing among you, giving them food and clothing. And you are to love those who are foreigners, for you yourselves were foreigners in Egypt. And these words from Proverbs 31, 8 to 9, a charge specifically to people with decision-making power. Speak up for those who cannot speak for themselves, for the rights of all who are destitute. Speak up and judge fairly. Defend the rights of the poor and needy. So it's good for us to be reminded of these words, of active love and of speaking out, of using our lives and resources and voices for responses to loss or need, including advocacy, as we consider our theme tonight, law, borders, and belonging. May this time together invite us to reflect deeply. In our daily lives, in our spheres of influence, in our professions, do we use our hands and voices to ensure justice for those facing great suffering? How do we do that? In our complacent world, where inaction and silence in the face of suffering are the normal, safe choice, most tragically, even in the church sometimes, how do we become people whose very identities as Christ followers, whose everyday lives are characterized by acting and speaking up on behalf of those who are marginalized and those who are suffering? Please pray with me. Creating, redeeming, sustaining God, open our eyes and ears and make us ever more attentive to your presence and work in the world, and to how you would have us learn, act, and speak up. Amen. Over to Dr.
Thank you so much, Dr. Yoder. Oh, this mic's hot. I want to thank you again for being here with us tonight. Ordinarily, for this event and these events, we often invite a person to give a lecture or to be on stage for a particular individual performance. And on occasion at Wheaton College, we have panels where we are a little bit more informal and have the opportunity to hear from a range of folks with different interests, backgrounds, vocations, gifts, and that's really the purpose of tonight. And before I introduce each one of our panelists and get the conversation underway, I want to read to you a very brief selection from a book called Borders and Belonging, the Book of Ruth. This is a brief reflection on the Book of Ruth that I read several years ago and actually was in part inspiration for our symposium theme for the year, which is talking quite a bit about the nature of borders and belonging. This is in a chapter entitled Compassion and the Law. And the authors, Pedrego Tuama and Glenn Jordan, have been narrating, re-narrating, sort of telling the story of Ruth from their own lived experience in Ireland, where conflict over who belongs and who doesn't, conflict over which side of the border you live on and which side of the border you don't live on, has been a very significant part of the history of the people and the place. And they are reading the Book of Ruth in that particular context. And this is something that to keep in mind as we engage in conversation with our panelists tonight. We will always wrestle with the temptation to define belonging through an application of law that is unbending. But if the application of the law results in unkindness, however unintended or regretted, then this should be considered bad law and should be altered, even if it is the law of Moses, or the canon law, or the word of ecclesiastical courts, or the various codes, or the books of concord or practice, however our ecclesial communities define the rules. So let me introduce you to our panelists tonight. So I will just be brief with these. You'll notice that on your table there are more robust little descriptions of who they are. Those are some handouts, you're free to take them. And you want to learn a little bit more about who these folks are. And we certainly welcome you to stick around and ask questions of them as well. I'm going to move in this direction, and then we'll end with Ali on the big screen. Haley Olthoff was an English and Spanish major here at Wheaton College and graduated just last year. She's also a hunger intern, and we'll talk more about that in a second. But she's currently a first-year law student at the University of Chicago, and she spent her hunger internship working at Justa Paz, a peace-building organization located in Bogota, Colombia. Our next panelist is Matthew Sorens currently serves as the Vice President for Advocacy and Policy at World Relief and the National Coordinator of the Evangelical Immigration Table. Matt did his hunger internship with World Relief in Nicaragua in 2005, and he graduated from Wheaton with a double major in Geology and International Relations in 2006. That's a cool combination, by the way. I don't know if that happens a lot. He also has a master's degree from DePaul University School of Public Service and currently lives nearby with Diana and their 4 kids in Aurora. Next is Joseph Cho. Joseph Cho is currently a paralegal on the Children's Protection Project of the National Immigration Justice Center. Joseph graduated from Wheaton College in 2019 with a degree in International Relations and a minor in English. He did his hunger internship in San Salvador, El Salvador, with an organization called Enlace, and he is currently awaiting word on law school, and will be not just planning, but will be attending law school. I told him that his bio had a lot of qualifications about law school in it, but now it's a real deal. Ali Trujillo is zooming in from Madrid, Spain. Ali Trujillo is a senior associate attorney at the law firm of Baker and Hostetler in Houston, Texas. She graduated from Wheaton College in 2015 with a degree in anthropology before obtaining her Juris Doctorate from the University of Houston Law Center in 2018. She did her hunger internship as at the Legal Foundation Paz y Esperanza in Guayaquil, Ecuador, in 2014, and she now lives with her husband and 2 daughters in Houston, Texas. I told her that she looks very alert for someone who is zooming in where it is currently 3 o'clock in the morning, so it's impressive. So we're going to ask her really tough international arbitration law questions that she will answer with facility. Okay. So to start, and I just want to do this as a way of preparing for the conversation, I'm going to read to you all, because you've never met these folks, things that they said when they were sitting in your shoes. Things they wrote to the Hunger Office, assignments they completed, letters that they shared. And I'm just going to share a brief excerpt from each one of these reflections that they wrote 20 years ago, 2 years ago, and somewhere in between. And then we have a question for you all. So you guys, these are blasts from the past. This is from Haley Olthoff on September 18th, 2022. The readings this September were heavy, but I think good for processing. I saw a play with a gringa friend on Friday about an ex-paramilitary combatant haunted by a family he killed. It's very dark, but also funny, a la colombiana, with lots of themes of memory, reconciliation, and responsibility. I thought about one of our readings that asserts that even though victimizers, too, are trapped in a system that enables and encourages their actions, they do have responsibility for their actions. And it is their own sin that motivates heinous crimes like torture. Yet, they are not simply inhumanly cruel and so out of the realm of explanation. There is always a backstory even to the victimizers. The play showed, I think, a good kind of power that the victim ghosts exercise to get something back they deserve that contributes to a vida digna. The author's reflections on kinds of power were revelatory for me. Yet I'm also thinking about whether or not gaining power through a big human structure like a government or the election really improves the lives of the poor, and whether it can be achieved without also being complicit with some level of corruption and injustice. This is from Ali Willig, also known as Alexandra Trujillo today, on March 25th, 2015. I was overwhelmed many times during my experience in Guayaquil, Ecuador. On a physical level, my senses were overwhelmed. The loud streets, the cat calls, the heat, the smog. On an academic level, I was overwhelmed by hard conversations in Spanish and interactions with the testimonies of survivors of sexual abuse that I could not rationally justify. On an emotional level, I was overwhelmed by the humility and embarrassment I felt being a prolonged foreigner, and then loneliness of starting over in relationships. Many times, especially in the face of systemic injustice, as I witnessed it, with wealth disparities or corruption in the justice system, I didn't even know where to begin. Sometimes I gave up before I started. Despite my insufficiencies, God pressed me, encouraged me, and restored me. This from Matt Sorens, way back November 7th, 2005. There have been so many times that I've wanted to give people money here, and I just do not have enough to give as much as I'd like. I'm not talking about people who come up and ask for a Cordova or $1 on the street, so much as people I've actually gotten to know a bit, my coworkers, many of the clients that I interviewed, people from my church who would never ask me for money, but whom I know have pressing needs that they're working desperately to meet, and for which they're trusting God to provide. It's made me think about my future and my career. I'm pretty much committed in my mind at least to live a simple life, foregoing a decent salary so as to be able to serve people. But this week I've been thinking maybe the best thing I can do with this education and talents that God has given me is to go make a ton of money. As much as I possibly can, and just live as simply as I possibly can in whatever society I'm in, and then just give the rest away. But I'm not sure. I don't really want to think about graduating and life after Wheaton yet. But I should probably think about it soon. Last one, and then we'll ask the question. If I could, I'd maybe do hunger again. This is from Joseph Cho, November 25th, 2010. But in any other region, that my cohort mates are in, I kind of dread talking to people about my hunger internship experience after I leave El Salvador, because I think I'll feel pressured to talk about it in a narrative that praises my experience and growth. Because that just seems to be what I should say about it. And then I'd be almost disappointing for whomever I'm talking to if I don't come to some conclusion of, I grew and learned. Or, it was such a rewarding experience that I'll take it to heart forever and have left an indelible mark on the trajectory of my life now, end quote. Through some of the interviews that I've been able to do so far, it's been very encouraging to see the way that God is working visibly in the work I've seen here. This has arguably been the highlight of my entire hunger experience. So, for each of you, briefly, kind of thinking back to what these reflections maybe have prompted, what was for you kind of your most significant, or what was for you the most significant effect of your hunger internship experience in learning on your own professional and vocational development and pathway? We'll start there.
Should I start first because I'm old? Well, it was fun and a little uncomfortable to read something I wrote almost 20 years ago, and I don't remember writing, almost anything in that letter. But yeah, my hunger internship was very, not to sound like the trope that Joe said we're supposed to avoid, but it was very, very profound for me in sort of setting the direction for my life. Not in ways that I necessarily anticipated at the time, but another part of that letter, you sent me the whole thing this morning, or this afternoon, Jamie, and I was, sort of thinking back on it. A very meaningful part of my time in Nicaragua was not actually my internship, which I don't feel like I was particularly good at, even though it was with World Relief, where I still work 20 years later. But the family that I lived with, with whom I became very close, my host brother, Silvio, had leukemia almost the whole time I was there, and he passed away 2 months after I got back to Wheaton. And it was just this sort of profound sense of, really kind of getting hit hard with this reality of global health inequities that I couldn't do anything about. I mean, I didn't know enough about leukemia at the time to know that had he been in a different situation, there is medical care that he could have accessed, and that just wasn't available to them. And his family was, like upper middle class in his context in Nicaragua. I mean, there are people who were far worse off. And we visited, as part of that letter was a reminder of visiting. They were in like the private room at the public hospital where you got your own space, and there was an air conditioning unit. There was dozens of other people with, without air conditioning in Managua, which is incredibly hot. And my host family would bring food once a week and just like talk to people in that situation. And it was just, really meaningful to think back to that experience. I think that's part of what moved me to working in public policy eventually, and more in immigration policy than public health at this point, although I get to do some of that in my current role also. It was also challenging to think through this, question of, am I living up to the standard I saw for myself 20 years ago of living simply? I mean, you all just rode in my car. It's not great. But, there's definitely things that I probably, in my idealism of being 22, would have said I wouldn't be doing. It's just interesting to think through that. It's a good accountability for me to look back at what was on my mind 20 years ago in that context.
Very cool. Thank you. Who wants to go next? Haley's going to go out.
We appreciated your car. I would say that a theme in my hunger experience was God working through imperfect people, which included me definitely coming in thinking that I spoke Spanish fluently, and thinking that I was going to be one of those hunger interns who actually did stuff on their internship and actually accomplished things. And went through the normal hunger process of finding out that I was sorely underqualified and to do things that I thought that I would be doing or hoped that I would be doing. But nonetheless, I worked through it. I think in the same way with even the people that I met there, my host family, my organization, they're amazing, they're wonderful, but you stick around long enough and you will start to see that people are not perfect and you see their flaws and you see that they're not this like idealized picture that you had in your mind of the people God is using, the places God is working. So I think, yeah, a lot of it, and things that I'm still processing was that it was a journey of like seeing where God is working despite our failures and our imperfections. So yeah.
Thank you.
I can go too. Man, mine was a downer. But that does like ring very true for my memories and my experience, which it was very validating. First of all, to come back and was in my cohort. It was in the context of my cohort. All of my peers and friends who had just experienced something similar, but at the same time very different. And everybody experiences feeling very validated and kind of recognized as like, that was crazy what you just went through, and you. But to the question, I think that my internship experience, my hunger experience in general, has kind of impacted my professional, vocational, etc. in, I think, two different ways. The first is kind of a very big picture way, in the sense that hunger and the values that I learned, and hunger being like just one step in the process that was very long towards me becoming the person that I currently am. And obviously I'm not a finished developing person, as I'll have more stages and seasons of growth. But up to this point, hunger was one part, and many of the people in this room were very big, valuable, contributing parts to that growth of understanding that even if my internship itself wasn't a phenomenally rewarding experience in the way that many of my friends and people that I've talked to did experience, it kind of solidified at least the fact that I did know that whatever I did end up doing, whatever vocational paths I committed to, I wanted to be committed to kind of hunger values, seeking justice, trying to do what was right, trying to live in a way that understood and was very conscious of things around, things very close, things very far, and try to be a person that would seek to like expand the kingdom in a way that I thought was critical, in a way that I thought was doing what's good, getting grimy, getting into the thick of things. And I don't know if I'm currently there, I'm a few years out of graduation, but at least I think that's a valuable thing that it helped me kind of contribute. It helped contribute to kind of that trajectory at this point, and I hope that it'll continue to do so in the next seasons. But then, like within the confines of the internship itself, the reason why it felt so frustrating, and I think that frustration was palpable through the excerpt that Dr. Huff read, was kind of just an understanding and an acknowledgement and a recognition for maybe the first time, for me personally, that humans are just imperfect, and that really included myself too. I felt the imperfections and the ways that I wasn't living up to what I, kind of like what Haley was saying, or what I thought I was qualified for, what I thought I was capable of doing. And that was extended to my internship site. They went through a lot of different things. I wouldn't say it's like an organizational failure. They just went through a lot, and kind of understanding that at the point where expectations and reality meet, things can be imperfect, things can be hard, and people will let others down, and kind of like how you deal from that, how you react to those issues, how you try to move on, how you process and make peace with those things are all really valuable to not just being a professional, but to how you be a human. And I don't even know if I like really learned within the 6 months how to take away, oh, this is how to move on now. But just kind of understanding and kind of having that exposure in that season of my life was really valuable. And I think that's just kind of helped me to come to grips with those issues as they come up now in my real life beyond Wheaton, and probably beyond, definitely beyond.
Thank you. Allie?
So always a blast from the past to read something you wrote almost 10 years ago. whenever I was talking with Jamie about this before speaking with y'all, I was reminded that, so I worked for Paz y Esperanza in Guayaquil, Ecuador, and before I did that internship, I don't come from a family with lawyers. I probably, like you guys, had watched some law shows on TV, or, whatever, but I had never actually experienced a trial or been inside of a courtroom in my life. And so my first experience doing that was abroad, and it was in the context of, they don't have jury trials in Ecuador. It's just a judge, and it's not an elected judge. It's a judge that's appointed, and it was in the context of a trial for a woman who had suffered sexual abuse. And I remember during that time, it was very formative for me, not just to see the process and see how it was done in a different country, in a different language, but I was in the process of thinking through what does it look like to be an advocate, and what does it look like to be a counselor, and as a lawyer, you get to be both. And so I think hunger really helped solidify for me that I wanted to do both those things. I wanted to help people in both of those regards, as an advocate and also as a counselor, which is kind of another term for lawyer. So funny enough, whenever I was in hunger, like during that fall, I actually was not going to apply to law schools, and I did. So it was also formative in that sense. I mean, I was thinking through about law, and I practice it in my day-to-day life. And if for all those people that are going to be a law student, either going there or if you're in law school now, you've probably heard of Oliver Wendell Holmes. He's a former U.S. Supreme Court justice, but his remark is that the law is the witness and external deposit of our moral life. And that's really all it is, right? Like, laws just are an external showing of what our morality is, and what would it mean that the law is the witness and external deposit of our Christian life, right? Like, we need Christian advocates, we need Christian counselors in that space. And so I think hunger was really formative. For me, it was kind of a turning point in me deciding what I wanted to do longer term, and what I'm still doing.
Thank you, Allie. So next question, next set of questions is kind of focusing on, I have questions for Haley and Allie on this. Just to kind of the work that you do and how you got there. So Haley, you're in the very early stages, right, of your professional development as a
First-year law student at the University of Chicago. You were an English and Spanish major and a hunger intern here. Can you kind of tell us a bit about your own process, this is recent, for determining and deciding upon pursuing a law degree after graduating from Wheaton College as an English, Spanish major and hunger certificate? Yeah.
Yes. So I think maybe one of the first times that I thought about doing law as a career was actually in Hunger 114, when we learned about the conflict in El Salvador in the 80s and the ensuing refugee crisis that the U.S. refused to recognize, and the role that my own country had played in kind of fueling this war that they then denied people any support after they were victimized by it. I remember that being a moment of being really disappointed in my country, which is a recurring theme in immigration law. I haven't quite got over it yet. It's every once in a while you just learn a new thing, you're like, oh, yeah, again. But that was maybe the first moment that I thought, that I would like to do something about this. English major, reading and writing and stuff, that's legal. Kind of guided my interest into that particular way that seemed like a direct way to make change. And I think I just wanted to make something happen. So in 3 years, maybe. Yeah.
Well, thank you. And Allie, I understand that your own focus and legal practice have evolved over time. And I know that you talked a little bit about what you first thought you were going to do and now what you currently do. I wonder if you could talk a little bit and narrate for us a little bit about how you came to discover and come upon international arbitration practice? What does the work itself of administering arbitrations between businesses or governments or other parties at the international look like? What does that look like, and why do you find it especially significant? Because if I understand correctly in our conversations, it wasn't necessarily what you originally set out to do. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. So during law school, I thought I wanted to be an immigration attorney. Actually, my spring after my Hunger internship, I worked at an immigration law firm in Chicago. And then during law school, I interned at the detained immigration court. So these are people that are being held until and awaiting deportation. So in Houston, it's by the airport. So I worked there over the summer, and I kind of started to recalibrate whenever I learned that there was a different course to maybe, bring together. My love of cultures, interacting and advocating cross-culturally, this idea of finding ways that you can understand your audience and really speak to them, having a kind of international take on law. And I learned about, just through my law school and doing, they call it report, an international arbitration. And what that is whenever you have people from different countries, you don't necessarily, like to say, I'm somebody who owns a business in the United States, and you guys are someone who owns a business in Mexico. We maybe don't want to be subject to the laws for court systems of each other's countries. And so there are now these systems in place called arbitral institutions, where you can bring in arbitrators to resolve your disputes confidentially. And I just found it fascinating, because there's a huge overlay of laws. It's a really fun intellectual puzzle, but also there's the counselor side of it, right? You get to help people that maybe in their own home court wouldn't get that sort of relief. And so I learned about it in law school, took some classes on it, and then got the job that I have now, which is working mostly with companies, but also there's an investment side of it, a treaty side of it. So representing sometimes countries or investors in countries under treaties. So it's a really interesting overlay of law, and laws can erect borders, and laws can and statutes and regulations, and these institutions can also take down borders, and that's kind of what I see in my practice.
Any questions from you all for these two in terms of or comments that for you, any additional thoughts or anything? It's okay if you don't. No? Great. Well, I want to kind of turn the conversation a little bit, moving it away kind of from, in y'all's case, your own kind of vocational journey in law. And I want to talk to Joseph and Matt here about kind of working for good in your field, and thoughts here can be applicable to any one of you. If at any point you have a comment that you would like to make, that'd be great. But this first question is for you, Joseph. So I was once told by the director of one of our partner organizations in Honduras, which is called Association for a More Just Society, that, quote, justice work is paperwork. And when he told me that, I was like, well, that doesn't sell very well. So Joe, I know as a paralegal with the National Immigrant Justice, I imagine that you manage your fair share of paperwork, or at least are engaged in work there's lots of mundane tasks as it relates to paralegal work. I wonder if you could kind of talk a little bit about this working for justice as being kind of plain and ordinary and mundane and incremental, especially as you are advocating or supporting people's rights to refuge, as you engage in your work with unaccompanied minors and children. Sort of what is that kind of relationship between the everyday ordinary aspects of your work and the larger kind of cause for justice? What is that? Can you tell us a little bit about that?
yeah, it's kind of a phenomenal quote because it's very, very true as, again, as enthralling as that sounds. But it really is kind of astonishing, kind of like a very frequent reminder of how astonishing that is, that it's very true, that a lot of, basically any way for all of our clients to receive any kind of legal relief here, it's just so much paperwork, it's so many forms, it's so much to just fill out and like revisit and re-look over and just make sure every individual detail is right. And these aren't like even fun details, it's literally just making sure every empty box has N/A written in it over and over and over again, and making sure nothing is left not marked, not available. So it's really, really a lot more tedious than I would have thought previously, but it is also like just a part of a bigger picture. Like you were saying, how does that kind of exist in a relationship? It's like so important, and at the same time, it almost becomes so routine, just doing the mundane and doing the paperwork, that it's, and I think many of my colleagues and teammates need the reminders that it's not just paperwork. But at least in my specific context, our team, we don't necessarily need to like be reminded of that, like, oh shoot, we haven't thought about that in a while, because we actually have a really, it's something that I never would have anticipated before starting this work. It's a phenomenal environment of like being in communication and being in relationship with our clients, like walking alongside them and talking with them and meeting them, oftentimes especially our kids, my clients, the unaccompanied minors who I meet for the first time while they're in shelters here in the Chicagoland area, and all the way up until they're released to their sponsors who they live with around Illinois, Indiana, and Wisconsin, continue to talk with them, continue to fill out all this mundane paperwork with them, and eventually, like after years and years of patience and hard work and just incredible like strength and bravery, not from me, but from like our clients, kind of seeing those goals, seeing those dreams realized, like even the hope of those goals and dreams of receiving asylum status or receiving a work permit or being, like a work permit. It's so boring to do that. Just like filling out 3 different forms to get to that point. But once you have that just small little card, there's so much you can do. Even beyond just like being able to work. We get it for our 12-year-olds, 13-year-olds, just so that they can receive all these other benefits. And so it's a really, really great opportunity that I didn't think I would ever have, or even knew existed, to see the paperwork as just a part of a bigger picture and see it as a part of people realizing their dreams and people trying to just do what they can to make what they can and try to find a life here that brings them joy, brings them dignity, and just do what they can to provide and just keep living and find the joy in that life. So it's mundane, that's very true, but it's a part of a bigger picture that's really cool to be part of.
Thank you. Matt, part of your work
entails educating groups of people, and especially faith communities, about the systems and structures that create the paperwork demands and the forms that migrants and others have to complete in order to live life here and elsewhere. It seems to me that many communities of faith, just kind of again thinking about how you engage in your work, are willing to exercise benevolent, charitable care for their immigrant neighbors. Maybe many in some communities is an overstatement. But fewer are willing to mobilize collectively to work for and advocate for policy change, for policy reform. Is that for me a fair and accurate read? If it isn't, how would you change my read there or think of it differently? And then I have another question for you about that in terms of the work that you do.
Yeah, I think that's an accurate observation, and I mean, we work at World Relief with lots of churches of different Christian traditions, but especially evangelical churches, and I think some of that is actually sort of rooted in an individualistic sort of theology that looks at individual people and wants to help them, and that's really good. But sometimes it's a hard time seeing a systemic challenge beyond that. Actually, I remember reading this quote in a Hunger newsletter. It's interesting. This is where it comes from. Colin Rogers Gates sent it to me probably 20 years ago. But Martin Luther King Jr., I'm going to paraphrase him here, but he said in a sermon once, if you love your neighbor, of course you're going to help the guy beaten up on the road, on the side of the road to Jericho. But that should be only an initial act. At a certain point, if you really love your neighbor, and the next day someone else is beaten up on the side of the road, and the next day someone else is beaten up on the side of the road, at a certain point, loving your neighbor compels you to ask that question, what's wrong with this road? And probably the people beaten up there are more likely to have the answers than anyone else, and to have the humility to listen to them, and to ask what is within my power to fix this situation. And that's sort of that jump from compassion, which is incredibly important and will always be the call of the church, but also to seeking justice. And I wouldn't say that nobody gets that. I mean, I would say at World Relief, our best advocates are the people who are in close relationship with a refugee family. The Good Neighbor team that met this family at the airport, and then finds out that they can't get their son to be with them because we've just had a policy change and people from that country are not allowed into the United States anymore. Those people become actually really great advocates often. They learn how to call the members of Congress and call the White House and to tell stories in appropriate ways that help people to understand the human effects of policies. But it doesn't happen all the time, because I do think it's easier to see the individual problem in front. And I would also say there's also people who love to jump to the structural issues, but don't actually know the solutions because they don't have the proximity to the people who are actually affected by it. That's sometimes I think that happens in other parts of the sort of theological spectrum of Christianity. But they're both actually profoundly important. And my work at World Relief, I lead our advocacy and policy team, so it's often helping connect the people who get the part about we're going to help this refugee family as they arrive, or help this immigrant family at like an interpersonal level, and helping them then recognize the systemic challenges that are barriers.
And like, just a quick follow-up, I should give another microphone.
What has been for you the most significant challenge in persuading faith communities to engage in advocacy work?
It's a great question. I think for a lot, I work a lot with pastors and church leaders, and I love doing that, and I really believe in the church as the instrument that God has created to live out His mission, pursue His kingdom. I also empathize a lot with pastors right now who are frankly in a really difficult position, because we've just passed through this pandemic where people had fights over masks and vaccines and things that we didn't even think of as political issues 5 years ago, but it's a very exhausting time to be a pastor, to lead a church community, if you just give a sermon where you read the verses that Dr. Yoder just read to us, Deuteronomy 10 in particular, that was just the Bible, right? That shouldn't be controversial. But if you just read that passage in certain churches, you will get some angry emails as a pastor, because that sounded awfully edgy and political. And I think the challenge is there's a difference between being political and being partisan. I'm going to be really clear, we try really hard at World Relief to not be partisan. You're never going to hear me say go vote for Republicans or vote for Democrats. But if the church can't say to Republicans and to Democrats and independents and everyone else that these are principles that we think are guided by our faith, that we want you to pursue in the public arena, then we're missing this whole sector of the human experience that, frankly, at World Relief, we didn't used to think of refugee settlement as political. We've been doing it since the 70s. And then 2015 happened, and it became this much more partisan issue than it had historically been. And we had a lot of amazing churches that stood with us in profound ways. We had some other churches who kind of came to us, sort of like Nicodemus at night, and said, we love what you're doing, and we're glad we've been partnering with you for the last several decades of this, but we can't possibly do that anymore because our church thinks that you're importing terrorism. And I would sort of be like, well, can you tell them that that's not where refugee resettlement is? And, we can give you all the stats and data on the vetting process for refugees, not to mention, let's think theologically about where this fear is coming from. But, it's a hard time to lead a church right now, and I'm very sympathetic to that. And I think the best thing that we can do is to help come alongside church leaders, challenge them both theologically and missiologically, as well as just with facts, to say that this issue, whether it's refugee or immigration policy, or frankly a whole host of other issues, is too close to God's heart for us to just say, well, that's political, so we can't go near it.
Thank you. Ali, this next question is for you.
So part of what we've been talking up to this point is kind of focused on the movement of people across borders, the particular kinds of bodies, people, individuals, families. I know that the bodies that you often work with are corporate ones, right? Ones that have commercial relationships, but who are also in the middle of dispute, right? There's conflicts over contract, intellectual property. I wonder if you could, for those of us who are unfamiliar with this world, I wonder if you could give us an illustrative example of the kind of work you do related to dispute resolution. I know you talked a little bit about this earlier, but I wonder if you could kind of give us some details or illustrative cases of these kinds of arbitration work that you do. And then I'd like to follow up this question with you and Matt, because both of you are touching on kind of work that you do that puts you in the middle of conflict quite often. And I don't know if that's because you guys like to be in the middle of conflict, but we can talk about that later. But I wonder if first you could tell us just kind of an illustrative example of the kind of work that you're doing in international arbitration law.
Sure. So I mostly work with people that have entered into contractual relationships. I don't do as much the side I was telling you about that deals with treaties and investments. I do the commercial side. So what does that look like? For example, we represent, in one of our cases, a minority shareholder of a company, and the majority share was bought by a large corporation, and he was squeezed out of his interest in this company that he had spent 35 years building, and didn't receive any compensation for that. And so, trying to discover where the money was transferred to by this majority shareholder, and how he can get paid back for the work that he had done for 30 years. So that's an example of a dispute that crosses borders. That client's based in Mexico City, for example. A lot of these are commercial disputes, but another one, the one I'm here in Madrid for, is based on a contract dispute between a contractor for a desalination facility in Ashdod, Israel. And we represent someone who supplied a component of that facility. So that's kind of what it looks like. It's so interesting because, again, laws can create borders, obviously, as anyone here and anyone that reads or deals with immigration knows, and it can also serve as a way to kind of take down those borders and allow people access to maybe a fair judicial process they wouldn't get otherwise.
Well, okay, so thank you so much. Back to my previous kind of alluded to this question. I know this is true for perhaps all of you, but I want to direct this to Ali and Matt, that both of you regularly engage in work that requires you to get in the middle of conflicts between people, organizations, address issues that are conflict-ridden, divisive, and they're not minor, right? So, in the course of your work, I wonder if you could tell us a little about what you have learned about sort of the art and practice of resolving conflicts. Some of the things perhaps you did not know at all when you first started out in this vocation and in this field.
Matt, do you want to go?
Sure. Yeah, I think the conflicts I deal with are probably very different than Ali, but maybe there's some similarities as well. So I work in public policy, so I meet with members of Congress sometimes, and depending which side of the aisle that they're on, they probably have very different perspectives. And then I work with churches and people in churches, and even within a given local church, there's usually a very broad range of perspectives. I'm often I actually find a lot of people in local churches are very receptive to the perspective that I bring on sort of how we think theologically about immigration issues. But there's usually one or two people who will come up to me after a sermon and not like what they heard. I think one of the things that I've learned, and it's not always come naturally to me, but over time, is to not presume the worst about someone's intentions. It's very easy to sort of knee-jerk react to like, well, that person is ignorant and probably hateful and maybe racist, or whatever the like worst thing I could think to ascribe to them. That is why they're responding in this way. And that's not to say that there's not racism related to immigration, or that there's not ignorance. There absolutely is, but there's also a lot of normal people who actually mean well, who just haven't had the same experiences that I've had and don't have the same perspective that I have. Sometimes they have a very valid perspective that I haven't considered as well. And I think one of the things that helps me in my role is, I was a 16-year-old homeschooler, driving around listening to talk radio, and heard some things about immigrants that now I find really offensive. And it wasn't that I fully embraced that, but I didn't know to dismiss it either. It was just the only thing that I'd heard. I lived in, a small town in Wisconsin where I didn't actually know immigrants. I just heard about them on the radio or seen stories on television. And that was before social media, which made everything else worse in terms of how quickly misinformation spreads. But I think that's a good reminder for me that were it not for a few relationships that I developed, many of them here at Wheaton, my perspective would be very different as well. And I just wouldn't know what I don't know. Which gives me a certain level of empathy for hearing people out and then coming at it, well, that makes sense coming from your experience. Here's what my experience has been, or here's what I learned that changed my perspective. And again, especially when you're interacting with someone who's a sister or brother in Christ, to be able to go back to what should be the commonality of the Bible and say, how do you think about this passage? Because this is what has been weighing on me. How do I apply what our faith teaches us in this particular context?
Thank you. Allie?
I think now having worked as a lawyer for almost 7 years, there are a lot of creative solutions to a problem. And I think sometimes we tend to approach it and we think that our way is the best way, and we kind of dig our heels in. And you see this a lot in litigation, and you're kind of unwilling to compromise. But if you approach the other side, and there's a human element. Don't keep them behind the screen. Don't make them. Whenever you're face to face with somebody, there's just something different there, right? They're a person, you're a person. You can work through a resolution. I think that, with conflict resolution, there is usually a solution, and you can find it. It can just take some creative thinking, and it takes you kind of taking your heels out and being willing to move a little bit. And so that's actually, my favorite part is being creative, right? There's usually not just one or two options. There's usually a whole host of options, and let's get creative with how to solve this. So if that's hopeful, I hope it is. Because disputes happen all the time. There's kind of a natural tendency for us to try to have division and conflict. But just as much as there's division and conflict, there's a lot of creative ways to work through things.
Thank you so much. I don't know if either of you have any additional comments to make on that, and as it relates to in your stage of learning in law school, or
I'll just add really briefly. I'm at University of Chicago, which has a very strong focus on freedom of ideas and expression, and I think they really hold to the idea that if I don't hear you out and we don't have a conversation, how are we supposed to make any progress on anything? So they are very intent on having a lot of different views, seeking that diversity of thought, and really having the spaces to talk it out. Of course, it's still messy, and of course, there's still a lot of conflict and tension that comes out of it, but that's something that I've appreciated and been learning from.
Well, we're gonna save some time for questions from our guests here tonight, but I do have a final question for all of you to consider. So for me, welcoming someone seems to be a rather plain, practical and simple way to express connection and inclusion and belonging. And as we've alluded to, or at least some of you have, and we talked about this earlier at the Thursday dinner, a lot of present day discussions about immigration or about borders often focus on the urgency of securing the border. And it seems to me that the focus on securing borders sometimes complicates or makes it difficult for followers of Jesus to think creatively about how to practically embody welcoming the stranger who are attempting to cross a border for whatever reason. So I wonder if each of you could share briefly about how you hope communities of faith would engage in the work of accompanying or advocating for the well-being and rights of people who are crossing borders. What are hopeful signs of engagement that you see, or changes that you hope would occur to inspire and mobilize more people to be plainly welcoming and plainly hospitable in the work that they do? Who wants to start it off, just to conclude our talk?
Chad, thank you for that question. I think the book of Ruth is a great place to start. And I remember you lending me that book, and I read it as a return to hunger intern, and thinking about Ruth and her experience. And I think that can really help to shape us as people and us as a church and how we approach displaced folks. I also remember something that Dr. Yoder encouraged me about as a return to hunger intern when she told me about holy interruptions. And the ways that the Spirit can kind of break into our lives, particularly in ways that we don't expect. And I think when people are displaced, their lives have been interrupted. It's not convenient for them, and it's not convenient where they arrive, and it's not the way that you would expect or plan for things to happen. So I think maybe as sort of a broad perspective on it, looking for the ways that God is interrupting our lives with people who are different from us, people we didn't expect to come and who didn't expect to come to us, and what God might be doing in that encounter.
I mean, I talk a lot about border security. It's a big part of my job, and it's one of, when you work in immigration policy in DC, that is like the issue of the last decade or so. I think one of the challenges is it gets presented as this either-or question. Should we have secure borders, or should we be welcoming? And I think that's a false choice. I think that we could have secure borders, so we have no problem or no belief affirming that our government has an obligation to protect citizens, to know who's coming into the country, to do everything reasonably possible to keep out those who be seeking to do harm, and that the vast majority of people who want to come to the United States are not seeking to do harm, and we could have legal processes that would facilitate their entry, especially, frankly, when it would be in our own national interest to do so, and from an economic perspective. I mean, we could have a good debate back in 2008 when we had a recession and there were not a lot of jobs of how many work-based visas would make sense. Right now, we have an incredible labor shortage in the United States. So for all the challenges at the U.S.-Mexico border in the last year or two, the number of people showing up and being apprehended by Border Patrol there is still far less than the difference between the number of jobs available in our economy and the number of people looking for work. So there's a really obvious solution there, which is to facilitate legal immigration, whether that's for people fleeing persecution or people fleeing economic hardship and looking for economic opportunity or seeking to be reunited to family. And our view has always been that you could actually do both of those things. We think there's smart ways that you can ensure more secure borders while also facilitating legal migration. And then at some point our country has to ask the question of how do we respond to people who are here other than lawfully, who are undocumented, who've overstayed a visa or crossed the border, but who haven't committed violent offenses or other serious crimes. The good news there is I think that we sometimes don't give Americans enough credit. There's our solutions there, and the sort of solutions we've advocated at World Relief are what George W. Bush advocated and what Barack Obama advocated. They're actually very similar. I wish I could tell you it was, on the congressional table in the last few years. It's not really. But it is that combination of, sure, more secure borders, but also more functional legal migration processes. And for those who are here unlawfully, some sort of process where you come forward, pay a fine for having violated an immigration law, and then earn permanent legal status and eventually citizenship. And that's actually really popular with Americans as a whole, with evangelical Christians. Lifeway Research just did a poll that found that 78% of evangelical Christians say that they would support policies that paired improvements to border security and an earned legalization process and eventual citizenship for those who pay a fine and meet, pass a background check and meet other qualifications. I don't know that you can get 78% of evangelical Christians to affirm like the Nicene Creed. So that's actually pretty good. But at a political level, it's very, very difficult. And I think some of the challenges is sort of either or thinking where we have to choose one or the other, and that's just not the case.
Thank you.
And I think it is generally like a much more agreeable issue than is presented to us, which I think is just kind of a symptom of where political discourse has kind of gone in recent times. But the people that I speak with, in my specific role, getting to talk with people really intimately and really frequently, it's just really opened. I think I've always the context in which I've grown up in and been in have been generally very immigrant welcoming spaces. But even within that, the conversations I've been able to have and the opportunities in the last few years since graduating have opened my eyes even more to kind of the real experience of not just necessarily being immigrants in the US, but what the process throughout the entire time is. The journey from a Guatemala or a Nicaragua or a Haiti all the way to get to the border, and then the things that kids, again, everything that most of my work is just mainly with kids, but kids and adult people in general are experiencing at the border and experiencing in their first few months relocating to a completely new country that doesn't have the parameters or things set up for them to just easily be able to hit the ground running. So I think what I would ideally see is just I don't know if I have necessarily specific policy recommendations that anybody would take seriously, but I just generally I wish that people, Americans in general, would be able to understand a little bit more about what the immigration process is like, which I also acknowledge isn't necessarily easy because I knew about it in a very conceptual sense and abstract sense before I really got into this work. But since then, I'm oh my gosh, this is not easy for anybody. There's so many rules that you would just never think about. Even if you're fully in the process, there's just regulations and statutes and things that are written in tiny fine print in one specific statute that was amended 5 times and then struck down a few years after that and then re-brought up. So it's just so complicated, and to be able to understand that and then from there be able to, and as cliche as it kind of is, just to get to know your neighbor. Not get to know your neighbor, although that's good, but just in general, people should be able to understand and kind of get over any kind of potential fear that they have of the immigrant, which, again, because of the context I've been in, I can't honestly say that I can relate or understand what that's like to be raised in a context which kind of starts to demonize and makes things harder. So I don't have a really good understanding of how to break those borders either. So in that sense, people who are on maybe my disposition towards immigration also probably need to do better about understanding how to talk about these issues. And I think that's something that I remember thinking about a lot at Wheaton, and not necessarily as much so since graduating, kind of how to engage critically and how to engage in these discussions in a way that doesn't immediately demonize the person that you're talking with. So I think just in general, there's so many different ways that I would love to see the church respond to immigration and be more hospitable, but there's no one place to start, in my opinion, personally, but everywhere would be great.
Allie.
I think everything that y'all have said is, I really don't have actually too much to add. I think I could go into a little bit on the legal side of things and things I think that we definitely could, that we could change on the legal side. And we definitely need more people helping and advocating for these people that really don't have help. But I know that there's a lot of groups that are doing that. I even think one of the alumni here at this meeting, she works for a group in Houston, for example, called Catholic Charities, and we're trying to help welcome these strangers from a legal perspective, navigate through this maze of regulations that everyone was already discussing. But I think just on a practical level, I mean, the church should be the first one there with open arms, right? And I think that, practicality of like being able to help, I think, like I would love to help from a legal perspective and I try to, but like the church should be there with open arms, whatever that looks like. And so I just, again, I think what all the other panelists have said is really spot on that perspective.
Well, thank you so much to each of you. We really appreciate the time that you've taken just to share a little bit. I know with panels, we don't get to hear a lot from one person. We hear a little from each, and we appreciate that. We appreciate you guys taking the time. You'll see at the end of we have about 20 minutes more of your tables. If you have a question, we'd love for you to write it down, and we probably won't get to more than 3 or 4, but if you have some burning question that you'd like to address to our panelists, all of them or one of them, I invite you to note those. And just Dr. Yoder will be in the middle aisle collecting the offerings as we go. But I have a question here to start us off, to give us maybe some time. We can also share these questions with folks, and you're also welcome to stick around afterwards and ask them if your question is not asked. So this question is to you all, and whoever wants to take it, 1, 2, 3, or 4 of you. From Proverbs 31, the call to speak up for others on behalf of those in need. This is a learned skill, learning to speak up on behalf of others, not something we were born knowing. Could you tell us how, any one of you, how you have grown in your skill, comfort, even willingness to speak up on behalf of others? What helped you learn to do this, rather than just being silent or remaining uncertain, which we still all do? Like, what was the process of sort of learning this skill to speak up on behalf of others? It's a good question.
I think for me, first of all, I love that passage and I use it regularly when I'm in church, although I want to add a little sort of caveat to it that there are people who can literally not speak for themselves. Immigrants are not among them for the most part. They have voices, and we should actually be doing a good job of listening to their stories and maybe amplifying their voices. Because there is certainly a dynamic that is completely true, that, looking at immigration policy in the U.S., for example, it's this unique policy issue where the people who are most directly affected are non-citizens and therefore don't get to vote, and therefore most elected officials are pretty uninterested in their opinions. And I think as a U.S. citizen who happened to be born with that status, not because I did something to earn it, but just happened to be born in Wisconsin, there's an incredible element of stewardship there that I think, we talk about stewardship like when we need to raise money for the church or whatever, and that's important. But there's also stewardship of influence, that just by nature of being Americans, for most of us, we have more influence than most people in the world. And I don't necessarily think that's fair. I don't know why that God in his sovereignty has made that the case. But I think it comes with a real responsibility to speak up on behalf of those whose voices are not being heard. And I think that often, for me, that happened when I was put in this situation where I had personal relationships of people who were really desperately in need of a change in policy. I remember the neighborhood I lived for a number of years, right after Wheaton, was in Glen Allen, a neighborhood where World Relief was resettling refugees, a lot of other immigrants, primarily from Mexico, many of whom weren't documented. And I remember realizing pretty quickly that one of my good friends and neighbors there had no legal status. And thinking about what does it mean if this single mom who, by the way, was a mentor to me in what it means to be hospitable. Like, she literally brought me food every night of the week for years. I gained like 40 pounds living in that apartment complex. Just this very sweet woman. And I remember worrying, and this was at a time when things like this were happening, like, what if she gets picked up at her job at the fast food restaurant on Roosevelt Road and is deported? What happens to her son or to her daughter? And I didn't, those sort of questions sort of kept me up at night, and I realized, well, that there's nothing I can do. There's no like check I can write to solve that. There's no amount of like, teach her English and that will help improve her life. That would help her improve her life, and that's important, and we do those sort of things at World Relief. But at the end of the day, like, what she needs is a green card, and I can't make that for her. That'd be illegal. But Congress can do that. And so what am I willing to do? It's very natural and human and normal for me to think of my political interests as what's good for me and my family, which is usually some calculus of keeping my taxes low or maximizing my benefits. But I think for Christians, we're actually called, it's good to think about yourself and your family, or at least fine, but we should be also thinking about those who are vulnerable, those whose voices are not being heard in our society.
Thank you. Anybody want to add something?
I mean, I would basically just echo it. That's kind of the beginning stages of my vocational journey, are also kind of just understanding that that's the best avenue that I have also to whatever work that I want to commit myself to is to be able to, kind of try to serve, try to, if not maybe literally speak up, but like do and embody the values that I want to see done by, like, I think by the faith community. Because another thing that you mentioned about, like, I can't remember actually exactly what it was, but what it made me think of was like an uneasiness that I eventually felt when, at some point, I don't remember if it was like while I was at Wheaton or the first few years after, but thinking about kind of speaking up for people and advocating for people, at a certain point, I think there were interactions that I had had or things that I had seen from other organizations, agencies, where the speaking up on behalf of or for people felt kind of icky to me, and it didn't seem like it was giving agency to the people who they were serving. And intentions weren't bad, of course, but I think, this actually reminds me of another thing you said earlier about how some people see things on a structural level, see the big picture, but maybe don't know about the day-to-day, don't know the people who experience things. And so, less to answer your question about like how did I learn to speak up, but I think there was just like a nuanced learning about what that meant, what speaking up or the things related to that look like.
Thank you. Allie, anything you want to add there?
Yeah, one thing, I think the idea of a learned skill to speak up for others, that's the paperwork. Right? Like, to bring this back, like, that's the paperwork. It's okay with doing the work, even if it takes a long time and even if it's a lot to learn. Like, I think that's a huge way you speak up for others, and you actually learning a skill and learning that skill to speak up for others, they kind of go hand in hand, right?
Thank you.
It takes work.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I'll add to that too, like, speaking up happens on these administrative levels, but it also happens like in your living room and in your conversation with your classmate. And in those situations especially, I think you can speak up and you can be a listener at the same time. And I think that is something that really helps, both because a little knowledge can be a dangerous thing, and sometimes we learn one thing and then we think we understand like everything about like a life experience that we've never had, and are trying to be an advocate for that person who we don't fully understand. But also because like we can feel the fear of that too, and think, oh well, I don't actually know that much about it, so I shouldn't say anything. But if you're coming to it as a learner, if you're a speaker and a listener at the same time, I think that can be a place to enter the conversation and not to be the one to put down your stance and leave, but to open a space for discussion.
Thank you very much. There's some really good questions in here. Some of them are mildly funny, so I'll save them for later. Like asking for a friend, anonymous. I like that. I don't know who you are. I don't know your handwriting. You're safe. Some people are hustling for jobs, is what I'm saying. These are good questions. I like these. Okay. So this is kind of building on what you just kind of shared. I want you to, as we think about engaging in the work of welcoming people or engaging in policy reform or practicing hospitality as a neighbor, Joe, or like you said, Joseph, kind of talking about get to know people, get to know your neighbors beyond the ones that are just sitting next to you. A question I frequently get in class is like, well, how can I do this? How can I do the things you're talking about as a Wheaton College student, right? And you were a Wheaton College student. And so people are asking questions about, as a student, how am I to be involved in welcoming people or advocating in this season of my life? And I think you're alluding to a little bit of that, Haley, with what you just said. Or, as a student who has limited resources, or I don't necessarily have resources to help all the neighbors that I do know who are in need. Like, how do I choose? Where do I start? Which is, if you could talk a little bit to the students about where you would begin, or how would you talk to your undergraduate self about how to start now that you know what you know.
I love that question because I remember thinking as a Wheaton student that I was really busy. And then I learned that I was not very busy. Like, life just gets busier and harder to fit everything in. And I did have some amazing opportunities as a student, and I'm glad I took advantage of some of them. I wish I would have taken advantage of more. I mean, I started volunteering with a refugee family in the apartment complex that I'd eventually move into as a senior at Wheaton. I wish I would have started that as a freshman. But that was a profound experience for me. And really helpful in processing my under internship, coming back. And, it was a really important part of how I ended up, in many ways doing the work that I'm doing. But even in terms of advocacy, like, again, I'm old enough where I remember I was here at Wheaton my freshman year when Bono came here, which was like the biggest thing that ever happened at Wheaton College before or since. And he talked about the HIV/AIDS pandemic in Africa. I was a freshman, and I was like not a lot of listened to YouTube, so I didn't really know who Bono was, but it was a big deal, so I went, and it was profoundly, it was this rock star reading Matthew chapter 25 at Edmund Chapel. And the next day they said that we're going to have this meeting of the Student Global AIDS Campaign, and I went, and I remember in Blanchard 339, and that became a really important part of my Wheaton experience, was being involved in activism and advocacy around a global health crisis that honestly I just never thought about before Bono came to Wheaton. And a lot of evangelical Christians had not thought about it, or thought about it in very thoughtful biblical ways. And some churches. And it was things as simple as like wandering around Saga. I don't know if you still call it Saga. Like we had to find the kid with a cell phone, because again, this was a long time ago and people didn't have cell phones, but like a few people did. So you'd find the kid with a cell phone and give people like a script of what to say and call Congressman Henry Hyde, who used to be the representative here at Wheaton, a very conservative Republican, very, very pro-life Catholic, and say, hey, read this script and tell Congressman Hyde that he should do something about HIV/AIDS because it's a pro-life issue. And Congressman Hyde did something. He was the Republican lead sponsor on the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, which is one of the most profound U.S. policies in the last several decades. Also, by the way, reauthorized in the Senate Foreign Operations bill that is hopefully going to be voted on the next few days, and that's been a challenge just in the last several months. But I'm not saying like wandering around Saga, make phone calls, got Congressman Hyde there, but it felt like it at the time, and I feel like we played our little role, and you all can be doing that. You don't have to find a kid with a cell phone anymore.
Sorry, first thing, Matt, I don't mean to make you feel, but when you said Bono, there were like 30 of them were like, Bono. But I think...
What you're really missing out. These are just the Hunger interns who are going to go get their posters ready that you're going to go see in 9 minutes. So they're not that upset with you guys. We'll see you in a second.
I think the first thing I would say to that question is like I validate how tough that like question is at Wheaton. Like you asked me, I was like, oh man, what did I don't know what I did, or like what did it look like. But then I started trying to think about what opportunities like were there. I know not even necessarily that I like was the example for, but like people that I knew. I had one of my cohort mates from my Hunger cohort. She basically started. I don't know if it's still going on campus, but like the youth prison ministry. Yeah. So she basically started that because she saw that need and was like, I'm going to do this. a way that I can get to know my neighbor, get to know kids really who are just going through something that I can't even imagine. And obviously not all of us can or have the capacity or will be able to have the foresight to be able to take some kind of initiative like that. But for me personally, it's always just like really helpful to know that I have friends, I have people that I know, I love, I care about, and who presumably feel the same way about me, who do these kind of things and see the needs that they have. And even when it comes to just like your day-to-day interactions with anything that's like outside of necessarily just like your interactions with other students and professors. So like, I remember playing soccer early in the morning, and there would be people from the community who weren't students or who weren't professors. Some of them were, but just like there are certain spots, certain areas where you will have interactions with people who aren't in the same season of life, and I think those are, at least within the context of being a Wheaton student, are maybe the easiest or the most accessible, I guess, of like trying to reach out to your neighbors and understanding the lives of people who aren't, again, just like in your classrooms with you every day.
Thank you. Allie and Haley, anything to wrap it up here? Go ahead.
Yeah, I think sometimes it is like the practical moves of like, where do I go to like interact with someone who I wouldn't otherwise. I think like church can be a place where that happens. When I was at Wheaton, I started attending a church that had services in Spanish, and that was a huge part of my Wheaton experience and just a huge gift to me in the way that they welcomed me. Also, yeah, every Hunger intern does ESL tutoring with World Relief, and that's like fairly easy to sign up with and a pretty low commitment. You just, go to someone's house or home for an hour a week and just talk in English, and they might learn something, and you might also learn something. So that's maybe an easy practical step that could make a huge difference.
Allie? No, you're good?
Yep.
Okay, thank
I think
you.
we're rounding out on mine, and it is almost 3 o'clock.
Yeah, it is. It's time for Allie to go to bed. Well, we're going to let Allie go, but before she completely falls asleep on the screen in front of us, we want to thank you, Allie, for joining us, and we want to express our gratitude to Joseph, Matt, and Haley, and Allie for being with us tonight. I wonder if we can give them a round of applause. I want to again express my gratitude for your willingness to engage in conversation and kind of talk about a wide range of things with our students, with our faculty and staff that are here. I want to express on behalf of the Human Needs and Global Resources Program our appreciation for you being here with us tonight. A couple of things before I invite my friend and colleague Nina Montalava up to close us in prayer is that we do have some books over here, 2 in particular that Matt brought with him that he is author, co-author, or editor on in one way or the other. They are, can you tell us what are the 2 titles? One's Welcoming the Stranger, which is an updated and revised edition of a book that was published in 2009, and then another is titled Inalienable, which is a more recent publication. They are free for the taking, so if you're interested in reading a little bit more about some of the themes that we've talked about tonight, they're both excellent resources. So it's first come, first serve up here at the table, so don't all rush at once. And then I just again want to just go back to where we started, and I'll have Nina close us in prayer with this paragraph from Borders and Belonging. We will always wrestle with the temptation to define belonging through an application of law that is unbending. But if the application of the law results in unkindness, however unintended or regretted, then this should be considered bad law and altered, even if it is the law of Moses or the canon law. or the word of the ecclesiastical courts, or the various codes or the books of concord or practice, however our ecclesial communities define their rules. Encourage you to read the book, encourage you to have more conversations about what we've talked about tonight. Nina, can you close us in order of prayer?
Let's pray, friends. A prayer by Lindsay Paris Lopez with Sojourners. Love dissolves borders. A prayer for immigrants. Blessed Lord Jesus, you emigrated from your heavenly kingdom into a hostile world. As a child, you were driven from your home by the wrath of Herod. As a man, you were driven from this world by the wrath of humans. You brought the gift of your wisdom, your unconditional love, to a human culture foreign to your way, of compassionate grace. You who created this world without borders were treated as a stranger. You walked among us, yet we knew you not. As we follow your journey to the cross, your journey to expulsion from a world that rejected you, help us to remember that you walked in the footsteps of the persecuted, the scapegoated, the victimized. As you were cast out, you walked in solidarity with outcasts. You were mocked and ridiculed. When our world didn't speak your language of love, you were beaten and bruised when you didn't assimilate to a world built on violence and fear. In this dark night of the soul before the sunrise, we travel with you, O Jesus, Lord of wanderers and refugees, who led Noah across the waters and Abraham from his homeland and the Hebrews out of captivity. You walk with migrants in their uncertainty, on their journey to a new home in an unwelcoming world. So we must walk with them in order to see you. If we don't see you, and the mother pulled away from her child, and the father dragged from his home, and the child shivering in the detention center, then we don't see you at all. But you walk with the immigrants, you walk with all of us, through the pain of a world divided into a new land of peace. You return to the world that expelled you, transforming it, transforming us, with love that breaks death's chains. You break down barriers between nations, where we need no longer recognize ourselves by boundaries against those we are not, when we recognize who we are in the life of the great I Am. Now we walk with you in this time of transition and upheaval, journeying to the cross again and again, until your love breaks down the barriers erected around our hearts. O Jesus, you stand at the border between our old world of violence and your new world of love. Guide our hands and hearts to tear down our walls, to embrace our neighbors as we let you in. Amen.
Amen. Amen.